I have thought about the intersections of queer and pedagogy for a number of years. The deliberate juxtaposition of those two bodies that I attempt in here comes from trying to talk about queer pedagogy at a recent symposium at the University of California, Irvine, sponsored by the Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. Then and now, I struggle with the melding of queer and pedagogy. Can such a thing as queer pedagogy even exist? For pedagogy is about disciplining the subject. Pedagogy is a heterosexed political indoctrination in service of a heterosexed institutional imperative. The queer challenges such disciplining, such assimilation, and resists the demarcation of acceptable and unacceptable, appropriate and inappropriate. There can be and are queer teachers. There can be and is queer teaching. But queer teachers teaching queerly still struggle against the confines of capital P pedagogy, which is informed by a logic of mastery, of individual attainment, and of institutional assessment of that attainment. In this project, then, I'd like to talk about the failure of queer pedagogy. I use the term failure deliberately. Judith Halberstam, in The Queer Art of Failure, talks about failure as resistance. Her purpose in writing the book is to dismantle the logics of success and failure with which we currently live. That is, she writes, under some circumstances, failing, losing, forgetting, unmaking, undoing, unbecoming, not knowing, may in fact offer more creative, more cooperative, more surprising ways of being in the world. Working from the desire for new ways of being in the world, I'll say that even if there can be no queer pedagogy, because queer pedagogy has failed, there is still the prospect of queering pedagogy. In fact, many of us probably already do so. I argue for a verb rather than an adjective. Queer pedagogy then becomes less a field than an imperative. Go forth and queer pedagogy. The energy in queer teaching comes from the failure of queer pedagogy, and the discomfiting, uncentered, unstable joys within and without the classroom. To play off Judith Butler, queer teaching opens up the field of possibility, without dictating which kinds of possibilities ought to be realized. One might wonder what use opening up possibilities finally is, but no one who has understood what it is to live in the social world as what is impossible, illegible, unrealizable, unreal, and illegitimate is likely to pose that question. According to Halberstam, failure is a way of refusing to acquiesce to dominant logics of power and discipline, and as a form of critique. As a practice, failure recognizes that alternatives are embedded already in the dominant, and that power is never total or consistent. Indeed, failure can exploit the unpredictability of ideology and its indeterminate qualities. Part of working that unpredictability, of making use of indeterminacy itself, is resisting mastery. Halberstam points us to Saba Mahmood, who writes that analysis as a mode of conversation, rather than mastery, can yield a vision of coexistence that does not require making others' life worlds extinct or provisional. In composition studies, we have long talked about conversation rather than mastery, about collaboration, decentered classrooms, shared power, about leaving teacherly authority behind. But each of these noble goals relies, ironically, on the ongoing authority of the institutionalized pedagogue, of the teacher, to make it succeed. Teaching queerly means risking failure, of opening up conversations that cannot be closed. When I entered the queer theory classroom on the first day, I opened myself up. "Ask me anything," I said. I said the same thing on the last day of class. In between those 2 days, that question shifted from a marker of mastery to a marker of radical trust. I take it as a queer teaching success, or failure, that 25 students left that class perplexed, confused, troubled, even angry about gender and sexuality and the incommensurability of language. Not that they didn't know more. They read a lot. Too much, they said. They wrote twice-weekly letters to each other. They watched and critiqued movies. They wrote queered essays, turning in mashups of image, poetry, and expository writing. They went to extra credit drag shows. They participated in, even argued, sometimes to the point of tears. Discussions every Monday and Wednesday from 4 to 6 in the afternoon. But I did not, would not, could not offer them mastery of such a topic. I even refused to offer myself as a master of the subject, frequently asking and fielding honest questions about my own stances on queer politics and queer readings. What does it mean, I asked, that I am married, but that I also see same-sex marriage as an assimilationist goal? How can you simultaneously resist and belong? Where does my privilege, as white, as middle class, as teacher, make me complicit in the oppression of others? I also take it as a queer teaching success, or failure, that I left the class perplexed, confused, troubled, even angry about gender and sexuality and the incommensurability of language. My students and I learned with and from each other. Queer teaching involves deliberately courting paradox and discomfort, for your students and for yourself. Halberstam refers us back to Eve Sedgwick, who said once that ignorance is as potent and multiple a thing as knowledge, and that learning often takes place completely independently of teaching. I think of those moments of naivete, of not knowing. Who are you? Who am I? In a first-year writing class a few years ago, a student came up after class to talk with me. He was very serious, but not unkind. "Miss Rhodes," he asked, "are you a guy or a girl?" In another class, this time a graduate seminar, one of the graduate students paused the discussion to ask me, "Dr. Rhodes, are you a feminist?" "Yes." "Are you a woman?" "Yes." "How do you know?" To a great extent, queerness and its subjects are asked to make themselves known in a classroom, either through the overt narrative of the coming out story, or through adherence to or deviation from certain tropes of homonormative life, gay marriage, homophobia, AIDS. There is great pressure to be out in the classroom, to perform one's queerness, but to do it in an appropriate way. In giving an account of oneself, Butler argues that this demand for knowledge constitutes a type of ethical violence, in which we ask for a coherent self-identity, even as we recognize in ourselves our own incoherence. The trick is to avoid mastery, even of that seemingly simple question, for we are multiple, contradictory, queer. Butler writes, "In a sense, the ethical stance consists in asking the question, 'Who are you?' and continuing to ask it without any expectation of a full or final answer. The other to whom I pose this question will not be captured by any answer that might arrive to satisfy it. So if there is, in the question, a desire for recognition, this desire will be under an obligation to keep itself alive as desire, and not to resolve itself. To revise recognition as an ethical project, we will need to see it as, in principle, unsatisfiable." What does it mean to be a queer teacher? What does it mean to be embodied, composed, teacherly. Who am I? Who am I? What is queer? What is pedagogy? The questions point to the failure of language. They point to the limits of discourse to construct meaning. Take queer for a moment. Sedgwick reminds us that a word so fraught as queer is, fraught with so many social and personal histories of exclusion, violence, defiance, excitement, can never only denote, nor even can it only connote. A part of its experimental force as a speech act is the way in which it dramatizes locutionary position itself. Anyone's use of queer about themselves means differently from their use of it about someone else. Queer and pedagogy, just like the I in Who Am I, are impossible terms, unsatisfiable in their definitions, and inexorable in their demands for definition. As teachers, as masters of a subject, we rely to some extent on the stability of language. But queer pedagogy confounds us linguistically. In our speaking, we struggle to shape ideas into acceptable and palatable forms of knowing. But language's failure here scrambles that knowing, demanding a simultaneous invocation of and forgetting of terms. When you're a teacher, that's hard work, for it demands that you let go of mastery in favor of the naive or even nonsensical. In queer teaching, then, we might find and celebrate the failing, losing, forgetting, unmaking, undoing, unbecoming, not knowing, that offers more creative, more cooperative, more surprising ways of being in the world. You must become the fool.